this ever-decreasing circle that is affecting public transport at the moment. And there was a period of time we also ended up with this COVID-19 paradox, where there was a need to increase social distancing on public transport, yet companies were running shortened or reduced services, so actually that wasn't even possible to achieve. In addition, we have changes in working patterns. Is home working going to be a long-term trend? Is it something that is only going to be adopted for the next 6 or 12 months? Are we seeing a shift back to private transport? I certainly have friends who would otherwise be catching trains to see friends and family across the country. They are now preferring to drive because they feel that it's a better way of moving around in this current environment. That's all very well, but what about those who can't work at home or don't have alternative transport options? And I'm very keen, perhaps, that we can consider a potential middle-class bias in this debate. It's all very well to say, well, people can work at home, but actually a lot of people can't work. Public transport has a key role in allowing them to contribute economically to society and allowing them to live their best lives as well. And so perhaps, are we losing the ground we've made up in public transport position? There's been a lot of push in planning over recent years to encourage private transport. Are we losing that as a result of COVID? And if so, how do we stop and reverse this? So there's some big issues we're going to discuss. To have discussed those, we have an excellent panel with us today. We have Tim Wood from Transport for North. Just trying to make the screen up. Sorry about that. Here we go. We have Hannah Hassenberger from our own Temple Group. We have Adam Weissman from the Ascendal Group. And we'll have a panel discussion over some of these issues towards the end. So just a quick update on the rules and procedures, just so we know how this is all going to work. Questions, please, held to the end. All questions to come through the chair. If you have a question, you can use the hand raise function on Teams. So give it just there. And you can also type your question in the comments box by raising hands. Is the easiest way. Dealing with this, we'll try and answer the issues as we go. I think if all attendees can switch off their videos, best asking a question, the best way to run it, just to give them a chance to read. So quick intro to Temple Group, if you're not aware. We are an environmental ecology planning and sustainability consultancy, and we work across private, public, and generation schemes in property and infrastructure. Our vision is putting communities and the environment at the heart of decision making, which is good considering what we're going to be talking about today. And just a quick overview of the level of service offer over the left, all the way up to the strategic level, all the way down through the planning, assessment, technical appraisal work for ecology and culture through our sister companies, the Ecology Consultancy Barbico, and also the Group Structure Consultancy. So we have it covered. Okay, public transport through the ages. Well, it has changed. So I've got some images here, which it did earlier. Good. So we have the horse-drawn omnibus, early form of public transport. That's from the London one, Camden. We have the trolley bus down here. That's actually from Brighton. Interesting to see the lack of traffic on the road. And then we have a tram system here, which I'm not sure where that is. That looks to me at the top of the Regent Street. Then also over through the years, we've had the Iron Horse, we've had the golden age of steam. That's the Scotland at the end of sheds. And then we have the diesel. This is the Type 55 Napier Deltic, which is quite a fantastic piece of rail engineering at the time. I will discuss that in detail if they're interested. Want to know how to build a third bank of cylinders into an engine that's only had two. That's how you do it. It's some I love it. Of course, we got more modern approaches now. We have the Eurostar, the French TGV system, the Japanese train, China as well. So international mass transit is something that we do well. And here's another picture of the Deltic because it's just awesome. We've Full circle in terms of public transport. Trams came back. This is the Sheffield tram. I also used the Manchester tram. Alas, not the West London tram, Leeds tram, which got cancelled. And then we have the Santander bike scheme down in London, which is actually a system that you see in other countries. There are nations and cities examples available. And then maybe into the future, here we have a shot of, these are the Bird and the Lime scooters, Venice Beach in Los Angeles, which, depending on your perspective, are either massively important innovation in private transport, a huge right public realm. That's actually a police roadblock at the border of Venice Beach and Santa Monica, because Santa Monica to run on pavements, so they actually run and confiscate the scooters off people until such time as the police go away, and then everyone rides them on the again. So lots going on in public transport, lots of ways we can look at it. First speaker then is Mr. Tim Wood. He is the Northern Powerhouse Rail Director at Transport for the North. He's been involved in railway design and delivery for 24 years and previously held directorships in 2 rail companies. His role is to drive transformational economic change in the rail system, with primary focus on connectivity between the 6 major city regions in the north. Now, we're going to start with a short film, and then Tim is going to talk us through it.
I think we have a problem with the sound.
Sorry, can we not hear? Can people not hear that?
Yeah, I can't hear it.
You can't hear it. Okay, sorry, Hannah. Carla. I thought this might happen. Can you jump in and?
Yep, no worries. I'll try and share this one now so everyone can hear it.
Yep. No, that doesn't want to work either, does it? Okay. Okay, we're struggling with the sound, I think on that.
Cars off the road.
Okay, sorry, Tim. Sorry about that. Do you want to just take us through your points in the absence of that video working correctly?
That's absolutely fine.
Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today to talk to you about Northern Powerhouse Rail and the role it'll have in delivering a public transport system the North finally deserves. To answer the focus of today's question and session, can public transport be saved? The answer is unequivocally yes. And part of the solution is Northern Powerhouse Rail. The unprecedented impact of the pandemic has been far-reaching and led to significant reduction in passenger numbers across the network. But it's important to remember that over the long-term demand for rail has significantly increased. In the last 20 years, passenger numbers have grown by 194% in the north of England. The recent snapshot over the last 7 weeks or so and the more likely continued emerging picture in the immediate future should not detract from the sustained passenger growth. When coupled with overcrowded trains, slow journeys, little resilience in the system, absolutely creaking with the demand that we currently had pre-COVID in the north of England, only by delivering transformational programs in full, such as HS2 and NPR, will the decades of significant underinvestment in the North's rail network be corrected. As you'll all be aware, NPR is the single biggest transport infrastructure investment since the Industrial Revolution in the North, designed to unlock the economic potential of the region by improving rail connectivity across the North's towns and cities. Through a series of new lines and interventions, NPR will radically improve capacity and journey times across the North's rail network, delivering a more effective system to unlock the region's untapped economic potential. That enhanced connectivity across the North, coupled with an extra 35,000 seats at peak hour between the key city regions, enables the North to operate as a single economy, leading to multi-billion-pound increase in the gross value added per year, creating thousands of better quality jobs in our city centres and driving regeneration in our towns. By better connecting the North towns and cities, we can rebalance the economy and bring tangible benefits to Northerners that will make a real difference to their lives. In the development of Northern Powerhouse Rail, we're asking for the North to be freed from the straitjacket of poor infrastructure that has constrained its economy and its prospects for far too long. We need to consolidate planning and development across the North into one process to level up the British economy. I like to use the analogy of a plane with one engine to refer to our country's economy. At the moment, we are just too heavily reliant on that one engine. London and the South East. It's not just a gap, it's a chasm. But the North of England has huge untapped potential, and properly resourced can help redress that imbalance. By 2040, the North of England will have a world-class railway network, helping to underpin a world-class economy. We need to bring short and long-term projects together in a real continuous pipeline of investment from now until 2040. And I'm just talking about NPR. This should include road investment, local connectivity, and active travel plans to meet the decarbonisation agenda. As a country, we are facing the challenge of reducing carbon emissions. So it's really encouraging to see the government focus on green economic recovery in response to COVID-19. Measures to decarbonise our railways are awaiting the findings of the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy, currently being prepared and then finally issued now by Network Rail. And we're extremely supportive of the strategy's objectives to develop options for decarbonisation of our railways by 2050. Northern Powerhouse Rail will contribute significantly to reducing carbon emission levels by electrifying much of the North's rail network, and it will also take 64,000 car trips off the roads each day, achieved by building passenger trust in the network through reliable, quick and modern services. NPR can play a key role to the economic recovery plan and decarbonisation now and in the future. Commitment to NPR is an investment in sustainable, greener future, while associated work will lead to significant upturn in the economy. We are really placed now at the heart of this economic development. It's not a transport system, NPR per se. It's an economic opportunity to really open up the North, to make sure that big businesses can come up into the North of England, to know that they've got a mobile workforce. So we're not taking the usual 3.5 hours to go from Liverpool across to Hull. We're bringing that down to just over 2 hours. We're not going from Bradford to Leeds, which is just 8 miles and takes 21 minutes on a 2-car pacer train. We're doing that 8 miles in 8 minutes. We're not having people standing all the time going between Leeds and Manchester. It's just not right in the 21st century. People want a seat. They want connectivity. They want the train to leave on time. They want the train to arrive on time. This is a pure basic need on public transport, and that's where we want to get to. So we look forward to delivering our strategic outline case to the Transport for the North Board on the 10th of March next year, and to getting the government investment that we need to be getting on with this railway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. So some big plans afoot in the north of England, not before time, I most should add, and I've certainly done that trip from Leeds to Bradford a number of times on the two-car Pacer train. Whilst it is certainly very scenic, it's certainly not very fast. So I certainly look forward to seeing improvements on that. Okay, moving on then, we're going to look at some of the more intangible, so we call them, aspects of public transport provision. And our next speaker is Temple's own Hannah Hassenberger. So Hannah is one of our rising stars. She works in our social value team, developing alternative measures of return on investment for both projects and schemes. She's an award-winning author, having previously worked at Urbaniste du Monde, researching the social impact of the Rio de Janeiro bus rapid transport system. She is also active in the volunteer sector, leading student think tanks on sustainable urban policy. So, Hannah, would you like to share your screen and kick off, please?
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. Can you see my screen now?
We can see your screen, yes, thank you.
Excellent, okay. Thanks for this introduction. I was asked to do a presentation about the social value of active travel. So I'm going to talk about the change of travel habits that we have already heard about, but that we have seen during lockdown. Then I'm going to move on to the positive health impacts of active travel and talk about how local authorities have recently tried to capture and reinforce this. I'm then going to talk about the increased momentum for healthy and active streets that we have seen over the past decade. And finally, I'm going to talk about how we can use a social value approach to maximize the benefits of healthy and active streets. So just as a quick disclaimer, my presentation might be a little bit focused around London, and this is because that's where I live and work and what I know best, but I would really love to hear other people's thoughts about how this could be applied to other parts of the country. So what happened to travel during lockdown? So as you all know, the lockdown in the UK has initially prevented people from leaving their homes other than to shop for essentials, to exercise, to travel to work, if they're unable to work from home. So as a result, we've seen public transport usage and private car travel plummet. But at the same time, we have also seen that urban residents, so people living in cities, have resorted to active travel, so cycling and walking. So anecdotally, in London, it was literally impossible to buy a bike for a couple of months, even a used one. And maybe a bit less anecdotally, if you look at the data for the use of Boris bikes or the Santander bags in London, the usage has recently exceeded levels even from the previous year. So how have local authorities captured health benefits of active travel? So despite the profound health and socioeconomic impacts of lockdown, it has also led to a couple of sustainability benefits that might have a positive knock-on effect on people's health and well-being in the longer term. So the two main ones are benefits from improved air quality and benefits from increased outdoor physical activity. And in terms of air quality, cities across the UK have seen a decline of 60% a 60% decline in air pollution already over the first 2 weeks of lockdown. And a big part of this is because there was a reduction in road traffic. And this stands in contrast to the pre-lockdown situation, where most actually of the UK cities have exceeded regularly levels of air pollution recommended by WHO guidelines. So better air quality would reduce the risk of health effects for urban residents, including cardiovascular, cerebrovascular, and respiratory diseases. And in terms of the health benefits of walking and cycling, this is in the context that obesity levels in the UK have been rising in recent years, which then increases the risk of health and other health conditions such as joint problems, hypertension, and stroke. And active travel can help prevent and mitigate against this risk. But in addition to physical health benefits, there are also mental health benefits of exercising outdoors. For example, reduced stress, reduced risk of depression, anxiety, and increased potential for social interaction. So a range of local authorities across the country have recently taken measures to not only lock in the health benefits of active travel, but also to lock out the negative health benefits of the return to the private car beyond lockdown, if that's possible. And some examples of this have included modal filters. For example, Brighton and Hove City Council have introduced modal filters to limit the vehicle types that can access specific roads and to close off residential streets and opening them up as spaces for people to play and to exercise. And then another example are improvements to pedestrian crossings. So Transport for Greater Manchester have, for example, reduced timings at the majority of pedestrian crossings in Greater Manchester by about 19 seconds, which is 18% of the usual wait time. And this is in order to avoid people crowding together. So most of these measures, they were initially planned to be temporary, but there's the potential for them to become permanent. Gained recently UK government support. For example, there was a £2 billion national grant to fund walking and cycling infrastructures. And we have also recently published an article on this topic on the Temple website if you want to have a look. So how have we planned for healthier and active streets over the past 1 or 2 decades? So initiatives like the ones that I've just talked about that have been implemented by local authorities during lockdown build on increased momentum for healthier and active streets recently. So over the past 15 years or so, emerging thinking on how streets should be designed has increasingly focused on putting pedestrians and cyclists before cars. And an example of this is the Department for Transport's Future of Urban Mobility strategy that was published last year. And it sets out 9 principles that should be followed where possible in facilitating urban mobility. One of them is that walking, cycling, and active travel should be the preferred options or the best options for short urban journeys. And another example is the Healthy Streets approach that has been launched by the Mayor of London in 2017. And this is a system of policies and strategies to help Londoners use cars less and to walk and cycle and use public transport more. And despite the advances over the past years, up until recently, active travel has not been that much of a priority actually in practice. So in a way, we could think about lockdown as having created an experimental environment that has suddenly pushed considerations for active travel far up the policy agenda. And while this is in many ways an unprecedented crisis, it's not the first time that a crisis has led to major changes in travel behavior. So, for example, following the 2005 terror attacks on the London Underground and the bus system, Londoners have avoided underground journeys for months and have switched to other modes of transport, such as cycling and walking. And in that same period, bike retailers have reported that sales were at all-time highs, which does seem familiar in a way. So, of course, this does not mean that we should abandon public transport, but it means that we now suddenly have the opportunity to think about how we can make active travel a stronger and more viable alternative and a complement to public transport. So the question is, how can we use the current disruption to push for transformative change and to ensure that our advances towards healthier and more active streets actually deliver on the benefits that they promise? And in this last bit of my presentation, I'm going to discuss how can we use a social value approach to maximize the benefits of healthy streets and active travel. So social value is quite a flexible concept, but it could be described as the quantification of the relative importance that people place on the changes that they experience in their lives. And this is the definition of Social Value UK, which is the national membership body for social value. And normally, social value refers to community engagement activities or design and use that bring positive outcomes to people living near a scheme or a project. So essentially, it's about providing access for the local community. And the idea of accounting for more than purely economic value of policy interventions and development projects, that's not necessarily something new. But what is new about social value is that it places stakeholders and their needs at the very center of policy decisions. So the people that will be affected by a policy or a project. And we could say that there are three pillars of social value. One of them being engagement, to understand what the stakeholders of a project value, including to understand the barriers that they currently face to take up active travel, and also what would help them to overcome these barriers. So, for example, engagement can highlight travel patterns and mobility barriers of older or disabled people in a specific neighborhood. And thinking about the barriers together with the people affected and co-creating solutions is one way of maximizing social value of an active travel intervention. And then the choice and design of measures for active travel should then be based on community priorities and community engagement, because importantly, social value is not a prescriptive concept and it will depend upon what people value. And we can also think about using data to complement engagement and to understand which measures are needed to facilitate and increase active travel. Then recently, there has been increasing interest in measuring and quantifying social value, and there are three main ways to measure social value. The first of them is cost-benefit analysis, which is probably the one that people are most familiar with. And this would be used, for example, to estimate how much different segments of the population save by increasing active travel over using their car during a given period of time. Second method is well-being valuations, which try to apply a financial proxy to non-market outcomes of projects. So, for example, this could be the reduced cost to the NHS from increased uptake of active travel. And there are already a whole range of toolkits that exist to measure and monetize social value, including for active travel initiatives. And one of them is the Active Mode Appraisal Toolkit that has been published by the Department for Transport earlier this year. Social return on investment is then the most stakeholder-led and time-intensive, but also the most accurate form of measuring social value. So broadly, the process is that the practitioner interviews people that are affected by an intervention and uses this information to measure the outcomes that they experience. And then they would use financial proxies that are created with those stakeholders to come up with an overall social value figure. For example, through willingness to pay analysis. So in conclusion, we are currently seeing a shift in travel behavior that resulted from lockdown and the COVID crisis. And just as in 2005, if we want to achieve a sustained shift to active travel, this will need to be supported by policy and infrastructure development. So around the year 2005, this was the introduction of the congestion charge and also the creation of new infrastructure, such as the quiet ways and the cycle superhighways in London. Today, these measures include local authority initiatives, such as the ones that I've mentioned earlier, and national funding for active travel infrastructure. So in this presentation, I have argued that these measures should take into account people's needs that can be different between specific population groups to help them move to active travel and to maximize social value. But that doesn't mean that we should abandon public transport, but it means that we suddenly have an opportunity to think about how we can make active travel a stronger and more viable alternative and complement to public transport. And I think there are a range of questions to which I don't necessarily have the answers, but that we could consider. So, for example, at a strategic level, what needs to be done to better integrate public transport with active travel modes? How can we support considerations for active travel in property development? how can we use active travel for the leveling up agenda? And finally, what does a general increase in active travel mean for public transport? And how can we adapt public transport to be better suited to changes in demand? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hannah. A lot to think about there, and I think we'll get to some of your questions as part of the panel discussion. I think certainly the need for co-created solutions is certainly a very, very important point. For a lot of people, infrastructure and property development is done to them. It's not really done for them. And I think involving the community in these things is absolutely fundamentally and absolutely key to the successful delivery of such schemes. Thank you very much. Okay, so final speaker, who I think is going to probably draw a lot of these strands together, is Adam Leisman. Adam is the founder and executive chairman of the Ascendal Group, a business that aims to bring cities to life by rethinking public transport systems in the world's leading cities, providing operations, technology, real estate, financing, and strategic advisory solutions aimed at bringing radical change and improving people's lives. His experience of public transport provision across the world with contracts in Australia, Singapore, Chile and Antarctica and Hong Kong. And also as a chartered accountant, he has a keen grasp of the finances related to public transport. So Adam, please take it away.
Thank you, Spencer. Just checking that you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you very much. It's always a bit strange when you're talking to yourself and you can't get the vibe from the audience, but please interrupt if I'm going off street. But just to give you a little bit of a background as to who I am, I've got a background, I'm a chartered accountant by qualification, but I have a background in finance, real estate, investments, transport, and then I thought I'd bring them all together with Ascendal Group. So more recently, I came to London from Australia in 2013, co-founded Tower Transit, which ran 450 buses for Transport for London, the red buses. We had a bit of a turnaround business. We built a really great culture and saw the benefits of an exceptional world-class public transport system and what it can mean to the community. We were then successful in 2015, still at Tower Transit, in winning the first contracted, new contracted bus system in Singapore, 400 odd buses there, the first time that they had opened up the market to a non-Singaporean company to run buses for them, because they wanted to bring change to the system and bring a new model in place which brought about innovation, customer focus, and a different way of doing things. So we were at the tip of the spear to make that happen, which was an incredible experience, bringing the community along, bringing the staff along, creating a very special experience where I firsthand was absolutely inspired by seeing what a public transport system can do when it's transformed to focus on the community that it's serving and engaging with them. So I was inspired at that point. We won a number of awards, including the British International Company of the Year in 2017. In 2018, I then sold my interest in Tower Transit to start up Ascendal Group. I saw opportunities to help cities around the world from the experiences I'd learned in Singapore and London, and also my background in the different areas. And what I've ended up doing is starting a group that has effectively four separate businesses, all of them focused on public transport and all of them complementary, but focused on solving problems to a certain extent. Mobility, running buses still, we have that, I'll talk about that in a second. We've set up a real estate business. The garage I'm sitting in front of right now, Westbourne Park in London, we are planning what we call a city village, and I'll get to that in a second. And then we have a finance company that's helping cities around the world restructure the way they do their public transport systems, because we have a lot of problems with the way they're structured, and I'll get to that. and then an advisory business, because the more we're engaging with different cities around the world, the more we're seeing that you need to swim upstream and help fix the structures before you can fix what's coming downstream. So very exciting time within our business. The site I was talking about in Westbourne Park, we're very focused, the property business is focused entirely on building transit-orientated development, but I would say next level city villages around transportation hubs, and bringing those two things together, the transportation and the development, in a very intentional way, rather than just finding a site near a transit hub and building it to maximise profit. The advisory business, as I mentioned, working with city leaders around the world to help challenge the status quo and bring change and reform. With our mobility business, we've just started a new operation in Chile last week, which has gone exceptionally well, and we've helped the government there set up a new model, which I'll talk a little bit about later, to help solve some of the problems. And next week, I'm flying to Hong Kong to take over the second largest bus operation there as the operating partner of a consortium that's just bought Citybus and New World First Bus, 1,700 buses. So exciting times. The business in the last 2 years, we now are doing projects in over 60 cities around the world across 5 continents, and we have offices in 10 cities. So in the last 2 years, it's been quite a ride. And in the last 12 months, even with COVID and what's happened, we've secured over 20 contracts in an incredibly good time for our business, which I almost feel a little bit bad saying, given how terrible the times have been. But I think that's also a symbol of what is possible. And actually, we need to look at the silver lining something as terrible as COVID has brought. I think it's an opportunity for us to change the status quo, like was just mentioned before, an opportunity that we really need to turn into a positive for our cities and our lifestyle. Public transport is the lifeblood of a city, in my opinion. It's essential for its survival to have clean and flowing arteries. This reminds me of our blood circulatory system within a human body. This is the map of the transport system in London. We've all seen these pictures before that demonstrate the effectiveness of public transport and active transport compared to the private motor car. We are at a bit of a crossroads at the moment. If we turn back to the private motor car over public transport systems, we risk accelerating all the externalities that we've already experienced from the focus on car. And I personally think that would be a disastrous outcome, but we're at a crossroads and we need some strong voices to speak up for the value of public transport, the safety of public transport. And there's been a lot of recent studies coming out demonstrating that actually even during COVID, it has been very safe to use public transport. And there's a lot of fear around that I think is destructive to our industry and to our cities ultimately. So let me just go back in time a little bit and look from a higher level. Why do we have cities? Why do we live together? Well, initially it was protection, subsistence, trade. That's how our cities first started historically. Then we started seeing these guys come along, and once again we continued this idea of living together around transportation trade hubs. And if you look at the US, you look at the UK in parts, how our towns and cities formed was generally through public transport links. Then this bad boy turned up, and for maybe the last 100 years, we then changed our focus slightly to cities with central hubs and tremendous urban sprawl, because we now had access that we didn't have before. Now, there was good things about that, but there was a whole lot of bad things about that. And, there's a list of some of them there. But, as an Australian, I've seen firsthand, cities built in that era around the motor vehicle now have tremendous problems to solve, and we're seeing this in cities around the world. So this concept of a monocentric city and going and living as far as away from the city centre as you can, and commuting in because you have a better lifestyle out there, but you've got the jobs in the city. I think we need to shift our thinking, and I think COVID has really challenged that thinking a lot. What do people actually want out of life? And we need to rethink the way we do cities. And I would contend that a hub, polycentric hub structure is much more optimal when it comes to public transport, but when it also comes to lifestyle experience, where we have a strong network of mass transit corridors with very effective, prioritised, frequent, safe services, which incidentally, when you have density serving them, will be more effective financially and viable. And then you focus heavily on those transportation hubs to build city villages, what we call city villages, where then instead of having one central area, you have multiple areas where you have pretty much what you need to live. So jobs, education, recreation, residential, and you have it all within a close proximity, which is served by active transport, by localised public transport or private, where you push out the motor vehicle because the externalities from that we all know about. So this is kind of out there thinking to a certain extent, but I think it's essential for the survival of our cities and where we need to be heading. Not easy with the bureaucracy and red tape that we exist within, but I think essential for cities to thrive and survive. And I must commend Tim and the Transport for the North, because I think they really grasp this concept, and what they're doing is very well leading in this space. Whereas a lot of the work we're doing is trying to conceptually get cities to understand the benefits of bringing together far more intentional planning with regards to development corridors and transportation infrastructure. Unfortunately, in this country, the lead time to build infrastructure is so significant and so complicated. The concept of then overlaying that with very strategic, intentional land development alongside it makes it the projects even longer to bring together, and therefore question the viability. So it is a tricky situation we have with the current framework in this country, but Transport for the North's taking that on, and I tip my hat to them. So you can see just conceptually, the idea of having a great lifestyle centre, a destination people choose to be a part of. And we're seeing that in the COVID, people are choosing to want to be a part of a local community rather than the long distance commuting community. So our strategy is very much around bringing those things together, focusing on mass transit corridors and strategic, intentional placemaking development around transportation hubs, and linking together the mass transit with the localised transit, and thereby reducing the reliance and the need on the private motor vehicle. So you're building vibrant local communities, local villages. So what's old is new again, because it works and it's proven. And by way of an example, one area that inspires me in the space of 15 years, if you knew King's Cross before that, you would know the transformation that's occurred there, next door to an international, national and local transportation hub that, with very little reliance on the private motor vehicle, but a strong reliance on localised transit. We have created a tremendous community that is now one of the areas people want to choose to live in within London. Bringing our transportation hubs to be the centre of the community, bringing jobs in their lifestyle. It's bringing together the development, the transport realm, instead of having them in silos. I think one of the problems we see in the cities we work with is there's very much a silo mentality. there's the transport department, there's the the development planning department, and never the two shall meet type thing. And we really need to bring them together strategically and saying, what are the objectives and outcomes that we want within our cities, and we need to work together to make that happen. And we really need to change the old dogma, the old mentality of how we do things. And that's why I come back to the start of this is, this opportunity we have before us is it's unique, but we need to take advantage of this disaster to turn it into a very positive outcome for our cities. Because if we keep heading the direction we have been heading, that is a lot worse. This is just an example of what I'm talking about in Miami with the Bright Line they've just built. But to achieve these things, there also needs to be a very strong link between the public and private sector. If I just switch topics slightly for a second and focus particularly on the bus system in the UK, you have some very different models. London is considered a world leader when it comes to the way contracts are run, and yet outside of London, for many years, there's been a restriction on cities being able to franchise out bus services. So you have competition on the street, which then eventually became oligopolies and monopolies controlling the public transport system in cities, and the cities having very little input in the direction of their transport system, and particularly their bus systems. Because the assets were owned entirely by the operators, and the operators basically had the pendulum of power. So recently legislation was put through to allow that to be changed. I'm just plotting here to give you an idea of different systems around the world and the correlation between that stature of that city and how it is regulated. In London, you see a good mix between the government and the private sector, and strong competition. In Singapore, with the recent reform, and Sydney, similar. In the UK, outside of London, you have a very dominant private sector in a somewhat unregulated market, and that is problematic. And I think this opportunity now, and New York is government-run, Stockholm, the opportunity now is to change the way that system works, because I think all these things are integrated, and you can't have success in one without having the whole package. In my opinion, a government's job is to harness private profit for public good. And at the moment, there's not quite an alignment between those things. And if we want to see the best outcomes, we need to align those things. At the moment, the bus operators own the assets, but because they've had exposure to revenue risk for the first time, they have, they've really been hit hard with this problem, and the government has had to put a lot of money into the system. And I'm challenging the government at this point that you can't just keep putting money into the system and keep the status quo. This is an opportunity to completely reform and restructure the system and come out the other side in a much stronger position. I think there needs to be much more competition put into the market for service, not in service, where the government can drive performance-driven contracts, and ideally you have a separate entity that tenders for the ownership of the assets, allowing full competition like we see in Sydney, in Singapore, in London. I think that will bring a much better outcome for the public transport system, where we can align private profit with the public good and bring these things all together. And that's where we've gone with Ascendal Finance, because we see this as a first step to fix the system. I'm going to pause there. I can talk for a long time on these topics. I'm very passionate about fixing our systems because we don't have any choice, in my opinion. But I'm going to pause there and look forward to the Q&A section.
Great, Adam, thank you very much. Thought-provoking stuff. And I thought, I think the point that you made, what's old is new, is very prescient. I mean, you look back at the garden villages, and the developments that are built by the Victorian benefactors for the benefit of the people who live there. And I think it's perhaps interesting that we're now looking at the lessons that have already been learned and then were sort of unlearned by contemporary urban planning to sort of go back to that. Okay, we've had a couple of questions already, but before we go to those, there was one that I received earlier, and it probably cuts across a lot of the issues. So, should public transport therefore be free at the point of use? So, should we be making public transport free, and what would be the pros and cons of that? Hannah, do you want to have a quick chat about that for us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think a problem, especially in London, with public transport is not only comfort, but also affordability, because it's quite expensive here. So I think, in theory, making public transport free, why not? But then there's obviously other implications in terms of funding. How is this going to be funded? Which maybe other people will be more knowledgeable about it than me. But I think like affordability is a really big issue in supporting people to take up public transport. So yeah, a cautious yes, perhaps, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. Tim, should it all be free?
That's a really interesting question. I'd say not, for the simple reason is that a lot of that money is ploughed back into the system again to replace, for instance, on the railways, old rolling stock and infrastructure. I think the key bit is to make sure that the fare pricing is far more simpler. So in this country, we have 6 million different tickets we could buy. And I think that's sort of beyond the realms of belief, really, that we've got to that particular point. So in the government taking over the franchises currently, I think there's a great opportunity through both the Williams Review and also further government reviews into simplifying fares, into making sure that we have, as you do around the world-class public transport. It's not beyond the wit of man to be able to achieve that, but it's working cohesively together to make sure that the key outputs are there and the fact that the money continues to flow. What we've had a lot in the railways is a boom and bust scenario, whereby West Coast route modernisation, we did a lot of electrification works. We then had nothing for around 16 years before we restarted again and wondered why it went wrong. And we're about to restart again. So I think it's important there's a consistent flow of work which will give opportunities to reduce the prices, give value to the British taxpayer, but that income coming in directly gets reinvested into those pieces of infrastructure.
Sounds good. Adam, anything to add?
Yeah, I would ask a question to challenge thinking as well. And who actually benefits from more people using public transport? And that's an interesting question to frame your question, because at the moment, if we're wanting to put most of the burden on the users of public transport for that service, that's fine. But actually, there's tremendous benefits to the broader society for those people using that system, including the road users, including the car users. The roads are more free from other car users, so you have a shorter trip. There are benefits to our environment. There's benefits to less cost on the road maintenance. There's benefits to less people needing healthcare. There is quite an extensive list of benefits that are hard to quantify. And this comes back to my question before, or my observation before, that I think we have often quite siloed divisions within government. So the Transport Department is focused on the fares coming in and the subsidy required to keep the system going, but doesn't really factor in the other benefits elsewhere. And when you start to factor in those other benefits, actually there is tremendous value to society by more people using public transport. And I think a strong case could be made to reduce fares further or make them free. I'm not suggesting to do that. I don't think that's economically viable at the moment, but I think it is something that we should challenge our thinking on. There are some cities in Europe that do this, and they do it very successfully. So I don't think it's a quick no. I think we should really challenge that thinking.
Okay, excellent. Interesting comment from a former colleague of mine, Peter Cole, also now at TFN. He says travel should take into account the true price of carbon. Public transport can't be free, but private vehicle use should be more expensive. Now, this cuts across an earlier question from Terry, that's also one of my colleagues, who said, with people feeling more comfortable using cars, how can public transport compete? If we adopt a carbon pricing model, is that a way to sort of rebalance the equation? Tim,
I was just say,
good one for you.
Yeah, I think. I mean, it's a really, really good question. That so when we just talked there about free, so I think electric car users, apart from paying the few pence that they do to put the electric to recharge the battery, it is pretty well free, isn't it? Because they're not paying tax, but they're using the roads. They're still using rubber tired wheels, so therefore they're causing it to wear, but not actually contributing necessarily to the repair bill, which you would do through normal fossil fuel vehicles paying tax. So I think building on that sort of scenario, the government revenues will certainly drop off as those incentives are already in place. But what we want to try and do is to drive a modal shift. We want to get people out of fossil fuel vehicles into more active travel, into electric vehicles, and onto electric trains. That's a really important set of measures at macro level that the government should certainly be considering to roll out probably quicker than they are doing at the moment, so we can see that decarbonisation agenda really being ticked in terms of those boxes. And I think we need to be mindful as well that when we look at decarbonisation, so 27% of the carbon in this country is coming from transport, whereas just 1% when you boil it down to trains is coming from that mode. So I think, you know, there's a lot of important factors that need to be taken into consideration when making those decisions. So going forward, it's at government level to consider each of these and working, as Alan said there, Transport for North been working very closely with the department on decarbonisation policies, and we've certainly been working very closely with Network Rail on the track decarbonisation strategy and how we bring these measures in a lot quicker. The problem that we do have with electric vehicles is this: if they're an electric autonomous vehicle, then you'll hail it, it'll come to your home, you'll get in, you'll go to work. So it joins the traffic jam then, as a lot of electric vehicles. Then it's got to go somewhere once it's dropped you off. So it rejoins the traffic jam again. So I think we need to be careful in terms of thinking about electric vehicles is not the panacea because of all the jams it will cause. The issues, I think, for us are making sure that the public transport offering is world class. And we certainly have some fantastic examples around the world to show what world class means. And in this country as well, if you look at High Speed 1 and what that's achieved, you know, it's the highest functioning railway there is in this country, free of delays, really opened up the economy, particularly in the Kent area, and development of opportunity for jobs, etc., which has been great. And that's what we want to try and achieve with Northern Powerhouse Rail. So I think investing in that public transport will really bring through far greater opportunities, which means that I can just cycle down to the station, get on that train and walk straight into work.
That's good. So to cut across some of those issues, Adam, how can the public sector contribute to that decarbonisation, and what needs to happen to allow that to happen more easily?
Yeah, well, two things. First of all, it's not just about decarbonisation, and like Tim said, it's measuring the real cost of using cars. I mean, look at that photo. Is that what we want in our cities? Do we want our cities to just be dominated by more and more roads being built and highways and segregation? But to go back to that question, from a public transport perspective, there is a big push towards zero emissions. One of the challenges is how you finance that. Because obviously there's a premium towards hydrogen buses or electric buses, and the national government is looking to commit investment into that space. I am of the view that needs to be coupled with reform of the system. I think the way it's been run for too long, as I said in my presentation, there's not the right balance between the public and private sector. The private sector has really controlled the buses in this country for decades outside of London, and there needs to be much more equalisation with the public sector. I know Manchester's pressing on at the moment with potential reform of the system with franchising, and a number of other cities are watching that. When you have that structure in place, you have a lot more flexibility to move towards zero emission and in an accelerated fashion. And we're seeing this in a number of places we're working around the world at the moment as well. And once you get the structure right, it's much easier to move to that zero emission mode. If the structure is not right, you end up in negotiations going around in circles for the next 5, 10, 15 years. We need more money. The private sector wants more money, and it's much slower transition than if you have the right structures in place. So I think we need to encourage Manchester to move on with the franchising and other cities to follow, and then I think you will see an accelerated push towards that.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Hannah, what can we do as professionals in the industry to sort of capture the benefits, the social value benefits of this move to sort of a decarbonated public transport, properly designed system?
So, linking to my presentation, perhaps about active travel, I think. So we have seen that it has become more and more important actually to measure and to visualize the extra added value that can be created by initiatives, for example, new cycle lanes or increased opportunities for integrating public transport and active travel, for example, by having bike stands next to the station. So I think this is. I think the measurement of social value, which is a growing field, which is still in the process of being developed, so there's still toolkits being renewed, refined, brought out. I think this is one of the ways through which we can create more value, and we can make sure that we implement social value and environmental value, because then also the social value, it has different aspects, one of them being environmental. So one of them being the benefits that people will derive from decarbonization or improved air quality or enhanced biodiversity. For example, I don't know if this answers your question.
No, that's good, and also starts to lean towards question we've had from Neil, who says, in my area in London, post-lockdown, low traffic neighbourhood has received a massive local backlash, resulting in local protests. How can we translate this knowledge effectively of the benefits to local authorities and ultimately to the public to expedite a modal shift? So I think perhaps we needed a quick discussion about, how do we communicate the benefits of this? Because we've had, Tim, you've talked about sort of the big structural regional planning. Adam, you've talked about your regional centres and the polycentric, handling social value. How do we engage people? How do we engage people with this new paradigm we're proposing? Because it's very, very difficult, as we know, it's very, very difficult to change people's behaviours, particularly when they're wedded to a certain mode of transport and a certain way of life. So what messages and how can we be communicating and liaising with these people? How can we get this message
Now, do you want to stay on that, Hannah?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Neil. I think this is a really good question, actually. So, yeah, I know that there's been a lot of backlash against all the new temporary or permanent active travel measures. And I think the key point is actually, as Spencer just has mentioned, to engage with people. And this can be done via different channels. It can be online now via social media. It can be in person. It can be via canvassing. It can be via public consultation events, etc. And actually, engagement in this case would have two functions. So one of them being to understand why people might have problems with, in Neil's question, low traffic neighborhoods. What are the problems and what are the concerns, and how can we address them, and how can we create or design an initiative that works for all of those people, or for the maximum, as many people as possible. And the other aspect is to create buy-in and to engage with people, to communicate all the benefits that low traffic neighborhoods could have. So, for example, in terms of environment, air quality, safety for people walking on the road, for local businesses, etc. Yeah, and then also I think another part of Neil's question was about the NHS and emergency service access. And I think that's a really good point, because stakeholders in these projects are not only the people that live on a residential road, but also, for example, the NHS or businesses in the area. So I think a communication engagement strategy would have to take into account those kind of stakeholders as well.
Okay, that's thank you very much. And I think, as a point about emergency services, changes to the road network are consulted with the emergency services as part of the planning regulations. Tim, how is Northern Powerhouse Rail with the people? How is it being responded to, and what do you think still needs to be done?
So within NPR, we're still making the case. And we'll make the case to our board in March next year. So we haven't gone public on where the potential lines could go. But what we have done is we've set out some really key messages: 35,000 extra seats at a peak hour, 64,000 cars. We've gone out in terms of the messaging of the strategic outline business case, which was developed for February last year, and said it's a £39 billion fully transformational network. If you consistently keep saying to people, these are the key messages, it eventually does land. And I think that's the important bit. You can't keep changing the message. You have to stick with the messages. So you're able to articulate those to all walks of life as well. But the only way, I think, to be able to support change is to persuade people, not to dictate to them. And using, media's there. We've talked about with Twitter, with Instagram, with various different modes of communication that the younger generation are really going to understand and listen to. I watched the TV last night, and there was a great article. This family have just won a number of music awards, and they're actually going to be recording in Abbey Road Studios, and that's where the Beatles were. And ask one of those family. They're all youngsters, sort of 16, 18. Who are the Beatles? They didn't know, but they knew Abbey Road Studio. And I think it's actually been able to get across in a really simplistic way what these benefits are to you as an individual, and make sure you keep with that same strategy. And I think there are a number of great transport opportunities, particularly coming out of this awful pandemic, in the sense of people walking, cycling. We've kept the public transport going. The government have made massive investments in making sure that there's still a really good, strong timetable there that we can use as we are allowed to. If we hadn't done that, I think there would be a position whereby just what's left, well, the only thing that's secure is using your own vehicle and getting in the car again. And of course, we all know what that means. So get the key messages right, absolutely like COVID, in terms of those 3 key messages: washing hands, face masks, keeping distance. most people can repeat that because it's lodged. And I think that's what we need to do as a transport industry, as a transport entity, to be able to make sure that we are articulating those really clearly, and that the promises that we make, they stand, and we can prove that they will deliver what has been set out in the due process.
Thank you very much. So, Adam, as both a provider of transport and an advisor on the transport, who needs to be persuaded? Who do we need to persuade? Is it the regulators? Is it the public? Where does the debate need to happen? You're on, Adam. You're on mute. Sorry.
Yeah, I think everyone. I think the community needs to buy into a vision, and the leaders need to have the vision, and the government needs to deliver the vision. I think we need to look at the costs to not doing that. Communicate clearly what those costs are. I mean, you see the mobilisation that's occurred with the potential costs of COVID. Well, there's 27,000 people a year that are casualties of our road system. That is a cost of our current system. One of the costs, not to mention the others from pollution or whatever. So we have a number of costs with how it's done at the moment, which we need to more clearly communicate, and we have solutions that deliver benefits to those costs, but actually a much broader benefit, lifestyle, etc. But we need to provide a holistic solution, as been shared earlier, so that people are tempted, not, and like Tim says, persuaded, because they see benefits to themselves to move to a different way. So if there's not an alternative that's more attractive, then that's when you get resistance. When we present and show and demonstrate alternatives that are more attractive, like King's Cross, for example, people want to be a part of it. They choose to be a part of that because they see the benefits. So we need to bring people to that point through education, through consultation. And I mean, I look in my personal experience, when we went into Singapore, there was, resistance, and we had a very strong engagement mentality with the community. We wanted to bring them along in that journey. We wanted them to own the process. We wanted them to be a part of it. So, we got them to select the uniforms. We got them to, come into the garages and have, we had 3,000 people at a fair day. We had competitions with the kids to, best colouring in competition, and we wrapped a double-decker bus. And those, we need to bring the community so that they can see, understand, not be afraid of it, see examples of it working, and say, hey, I want some of that. And I look at what Hannah was saying earlier with Transport for London, with all the extra bike lanes that have popped up in a temporary capacity during this period. And I would never normally ride a bike in London, because I thought it was too dangerous. And now all of a sudden, and then I've done it this year, and I'm like, hey, this is really good. I feel safe. These bike lanes are fantastic. I'm going to do this more often. More and more people use it. And then there's a reduction of the number of people using cars. The roads free up slightly. That there's the cascading effect of benefits which we need to communicate. But yeah, I mean, it's not an easy task, but it's a necessary one for sure.
Great. Thanks very much. Yeah, actually, you can move across a question from Michael Hill, who asks, how do we control and mitigate the hazard of electric scooters clashing with walking public in the same space? So we've talked about the need to mix the types of transport, active travel, with sort of more traditional style of transport. You just mentioned, the temporary bike lanes. How do we, and there is pushback. I mean, I mentioned the Los Angeles example. I mean, that scheme is not a scheme, it's a totally private enterprise, which they just park the scooters. It causes a huge amount of division in the local community there. The scooters get parked in front of people's drives, in the front gardens. They just get left in the street. But they do have a role to play. So how do we integrate these new and emerging methods of private transport with the existing road user network and the transport network? What's the best way of doing that? Is it a communication problem? Is it an infrastructure problem? What's really the best approach? Hannah, on mute still. Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
Yeah, I think, as you say, those electric scooters and also bikes, they do play a role in urban transport strategy as people with maybe reduced mobility. I think it's very important to also include like these types of transport. I think there definitely needs to be some regulation, and there is regulation, right, which is different from city to city. So it's different in London than it is in Paris, where you can see electric scooters that have been implemented all over the city without it feels like without really thinking about how this could be governed, actually, because then you end up with scooters on the pavement in the middle of the street, and people with prams, they can't really use the pavements anymore, or with wheelchairs or anything. And then there's also the issue of scooters on bike lanes. So I think this needs to be regulated, and I think if we want to include electric scooters and bikes in an urban transport strategy, then there has to be a strategy beforehand, I would say.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Certainly with the Santa Monica example, I mean, the argument often positioned for the use of scooters as it takes people off the cars, but of course it actually doesn't. It actually stops people walking. So they're used by people who would otherwise have walked, who they're just now scooting. So it's not actually making that big a difference. And whilst I do think they have a role to play, it's perhaps not as black and white as that. Tim, in terms of sort of integrating these more, let's call them emerging methods of transport with the Powerhouse Rail scheme, what's your view on that? How do you think that can be best achieved?
So first of all, I'd just like to agree with Hannah. I mean, I think regulation is really important. And then I'd like to just put another really basic point across. So there's lots of learning both in this country and around the world. And it's how you capture that learning to make sure that transport planners can start to utilize that in plans that they're putting forward for either developments in local areas or on a far bigger scale. We just don't do that well in this country at all. So when I'm building, Northern Powerhouse Rail, you think mega project, £39 billion, everybody be knocking at my door saying, just be careful, these are a lot of the issues you may face. I've had nobody, not one person. So £39 billion worth of taxpayers' money, and off we go. And of course, what probably would happen. There's only 2% of mega projects in the world that ever come in on programme and on budget. And I think that is not the way that we should really be going forward in terms of development plans. So particularly scooters coming on board, etc. For us, as we plan our new stations, we'd be looking for those sort of parked areas, those safe parked areas where they can be put away so people can come and collect them when they get off the train. And then utilize them on what I would have thought would have been helpful segregated sort of cycle lanes. I mean, the other great thing about this country is, when we're facing real adversity, oddly, we move really quickly. So the Nightingale hospitals, the one at the Excel there, was built in 9 days. There were no contracts in place. There was a matter of phone calls and a set of SMEs and a leading tier one contractor who'd never worked together. And yet they managed to get the first pieces of those hospitals ready in 9 days. Now, China's done it in sort of 3 or 4 days. For us, I think, where is our Nightingale moments in transport? Because we're all doing slightly different things, and yet we're trying to achieve probably the same outcomes, which is for the human race a far better transport system to be able to get people around. Transport per se, transport's really an economic driver. It's one of those key pieces to getting people around to good jobs and making sure that they in a timely fashion and in a comfortable fashion. And I think that rethink piece now really is very prevalent coming out of COVID-19, that we make sure that we pick up those new transformative pieces of transport, as well as some of the older methods that we've always used, buses, etc., trams, and make sure that we can show that full integration of how they all can work seamlessly together, because they can do. It's where we have issues in terms of space. So when we're wanting to work in Leeds or in Manchester, where is the spare ground that we can keep extending? Well, actually, there isn't. So we have to look at solutions that maybe are underground, because we can keep the people segregated. So we are still allowing those big developments that are going on, because, you know, stations are really a central hub in a city or in a town, and the land around that area, as we've shown with our land value capture models, is really, really invaluable, and we can put a number on that as well. So we need to have that holistic thinking. There are a lot of experts in this country, but the overall strategy for me still is not there, that it actually you can get off the shelf and roll it out. You're not going to be able to do that in all areas, but at least you can move at pace, really thinking about the issues, and make sure you've got a regulation in place. You've got the opportunity to be able to park vehicles. People can get easy access to them. You know, why do we all need to own our cars anymore? I don't think we do. You know, there's great opportunity there. We just want a seamless system to get us to and from our home, to our work, or when we're on holiday to get around as a tourist to enjoy the various places that we can do in this country, which are fantastic.
That's great. That's great. I think the key word you've just phrased there is seamless, isn't it? It's putting it together. So Adam, e-bikes and scooters and your polycentric urban villages, a useful contributor?
Oh, definitely. But like's been said, it needs to be done within certain regulation and confines. I mean, you need safety above all else, right? You don't want, I mean, those scooters can get up to quite some speed. You don't want them, like, you know, knocking over young kids. I mean, there are a number of deaths that have occurred on scooters already. It is a problem that needs to be tackled, but I do think it is a positive contribution at the same time. And, you know, I would say, you know, what Tim said is spot on. And I wouldn't just say seamless is the key word. I would say holistic is the key word. And actually bringing the thinking together, bringing the thinking around the transportation hubs. What are we trying to create? What is the overall objective we want to do? And we want to have integration between all the different modes. So we're creating a network that works well. And there's benefits in everything, right? We do need the car. We need the car in certain capacities, but we're overusing the car. So we need to up the alternatives. We need better, more frequent, safer public transport to get hubs connected. We need the cars to go beyond that, and we need the localized public transport system, but we need the infrastructure in place to make that safe and to make that convenient. And so I think what Tim's saying, what Hannah's saying, spot on. A good contribution, but we're at a crossroads. This is an opportunity. In Australia, we have plenty of bushfires. They burn up, you know, vast amounts of landscape, disaster, but actually they open up seeds, and from those seeds, new life comes. And I think we're at one of those moments in time now where we're at a crossroads. We can really go down a very exciting path to change the way we've done things for a much better outcome, or we can continue on the status quo. And you know where my vote is.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much. Now there's a final point here from Olivia Kearns, and we've sort of already looked at this. This is asking about changing to pedestrian crossing wait times. I think, you know, what's the impact on safety, air quality, and traffic flow? So to sort of tie that in a little bit with what we've all just said, it's sort of rebalancing the urban infrastructure in favour of the pedestrian. And probably just a couple of minutes from each, by rebalancing that infrastructure, what are our major benefits, what are our major negatives from doing that? Hannah, do you want to just give us a quick final para to finish with?
Yeah, sure. I'm just going to answer the question really quickly also, because
Okay.
I think with everything that I've tried to convey, actually, I think it depends, the changes to pedestrian crossings, I think it depends on the area in the city, it depends on the local context. So for example, I could think that for busy streets, for really busy streets with lots of car traffic, lots of pedestrian movement, increased frequency could perhaps be a solution, whereas for other more residential streets perhaps, or like smaller streets, maybe we can think about other things, such as maybe even like eliminating traffic lights, and just to respond to the things that you mentioned in your question, also to facilitate traffic flow, and to not to have lots of idling vehicles. And yeah, I think the benefits of shifting an urban transport strategy towards to have a focus on pedestrians and cyclists is there are many of them, and there's environmental benefits, there's benefits in terms of health and well-being, there's economic benefits of increasing footfall in high streets, for example. And yeah, I've already spoken.
Yeah, I know. We've come across. there. So, Adam, final point from you. What's the one or two big things we can do to rebalance the equation here?
Yeah, we'll use the crisis. Use the crisis. Communicate the objectives, the outcomes we want to achieve, what we're trying to fix, the problems that we're trying to resolve. I think, I talked about the bus model before. There's a unique opportunity where I think the private sector may actually welcome the change, which has not been the case for 20 years. I think the community is more open to change at the moment, particularly focused on lifestyle locations, active transport, local communities. So whilst it's been a terrible year, I think there is an opportunity now to have a different conversation that we couldn't have had without that crisis. And I think we need to have that conversation, and we need a strong voice, a strong united voice in the public transport space as to the benefits that we can create for our communities if we do this well. So I think press on and speak up.
Excellent. And Tim, as the strong voice in the public transport community, how would you respond to that?
I think the most important piece here is agree a long-term strategy and stick with it. Don't keep changing things, because programs of work like mine, like High Speed 2, outlive a parliamentary period. And I think change brings cost, brings confusion, and potentially kills off programs. So I think it's really important that the key strategy is set, we stick with it, and we get those messages out to the public, so the public are well aware, as we're persuading them, that this is the way that we need to go forward. So when we look at the city centres we've got at the moment, I don't really want to see cars in the city centres. I want to see a really strong public transport offering so we can get around. And that, of course, includes everybody, not just necessarily able-bodied people, but also people that may struggle with their mobility to be able to get around. And I think, as Adam said there, COVID's a catalyst for me, but I also want to see what's the Nightingale opportunity coming forward. And we all need to be able to stick together as well on this, both the public and the private sector, and having that real key expertise. So people that work on Northern Powerhouse Rail, I don't really care who they work for, what their CAT badge says. It's the individual to me that's the most important. It's that A-team person that is able to deliver what we need at pace. And they're all tuned into the way that we collaboratively work together, the way that we're able to influence government, the way that we are able to make sure that programs of work, people are physically seeing those starting. Because I think that's another thing. We can all talk about these things as policymakers, but actually that spade in the ground is probably the most important piece. Back to COVID, we saw the pop-up lanes appear all over the north, certainly where I live here in Lancaster. Absolutely fantastic. Happens practically overnight, and it's always the same story, that we can pontificate for an awful long time, spend an awful lot of money and not deliver anything, or we can really focus hard on these are the outcomes. This is how we need to progress, and this is how we get on with it.
That's great.
Agree.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So really, if I was to tease 5 key themes about what we've talked about this morning, which we have talked about a great deal, so I thank you for all contributors for that. We need to be looking at inclusion. We need to be looking at communication. We need a long-term strategy. We need to leverage the opportunity in front of us. And most of all, we need to get on with delivery. And I think on that basis, I think we'll close the webinar. I want to thank very much Adam, Tim, Hannah. I'd like to thank Carla for arranging and just keeping things going in the background. All the people who've contributed either questions on the chat here or those who've emailed them to me separately. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again soon. And thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.